You know, when you see the ocean turn that strange rusty red, you know something's wrong. But what if I told you the real story isn't just about the color? It's actually a hidden drama, a tiny microscopic war, a battle between friends and foes that literally decides the fate of our coastlines.
So what if the secret to stopping these devastating red tides was a microscopic battle happening all around them? I mean, what if the key wasn't some huge, complex solution, but an invisible war happening between bacteria and every single drop of that water? Well, that's exactly the story we're diving into today. All right, so let's get into it. The main character in this story, well, maybe the villain, is this tiny organism called Karenia brevis. This is the culprit behind those infamous red tides you hear about in the Gulf of Mexico. And believe me, when this thing blooms, the consequences are huge.
I mean, don't just take my word for it. The researchers who did this work put it bluntly, these blooms are decimating coastal ecology, local economies, and human health. So yeah, this goes way beyond just some weird colored water. We're talking about a full-on environmental crisis every single time.
And when we say crisis, we mean it. We're talking about widespread fish kills, like beaches covered in them, marine mammals dying, shellfish getting so contaminated with neurotoxins that they become poisonous to us. And of course, this leads to huge disruptions for coastal economies. Fisheries shut down, tourism takes a hit. It's a disaster on pretty much every front.
Okay, so here's the mystery. We've always known that these blooms eventually just go away. They die off. But the big question was always why. Scientists had a hunch that the answer wasn't something external, but something right there in the water with the algae, a hidden killer. So they decided to set up a kind of microscopic dragnet to catch the culprit in the act.
And the experiment was actually pretty clever in its simplicity. Here's what they did. First, they went out and collected water samples right from the middle of a red tide in the Gulf of Mexico. Then they filtered that water to isolate the natural bacteria floating around in there. The crucial step? They took those isolated bacteria and added them to a perfectly healthy lab culture of the red tide algae. And then they just watched to see what would happen.
And whoa, the results were dramatic, to say the least. Just look at this graph. The top lines are the controls. You know, the algae without the added bacteria. They're doing just fine, growing happily. But look at that red line. That's the one where they added the bacterial mix. The algae population just crashes. I mean, it plummets to basically zero in a matter of days. This was the smoking gun. Something in that water was absolutely lethal to the algae.
So now they knew something was killing it. The next logical step was to figure out who these microscopic assassins were. They had to go from a whole community of bacteria to identifying the specific culprits in the lineup.
And here are our prime suspects. The investigation managed to pinpoint two species that were particularly nasty, Croceibacter atlanticus and Pseudoalteromonas spongiae. When they tested these guys one-on-one with the algae in the lab, yep, they were incredibly effective killers.
But how were they doing it? What was their weapon? Well, it turns out one of them, P. spongiae, releases this kind of secret weapon, an enzyme called a serine protease. You can think of it like a pair of molecular scissors. It goes around snipping up the proteins in the algae's cells until they just pop. The cells literally burst and die. Pretty brutal, right?
Okay, so you might think, case closed, we found the killers. But this is where the story gets a really interesting twist. The researchers realized that not all the bacteria in the water were enemies. In fact, some of them were acting like allies.
Yeah, the story has a twist, because this whole battle wasn't one-sided at all. While some bacteria were out there trying to kill the algae, a whole other group seemed to be actively helping it thrive.
And they saw this partnership playing out in the wild. When they looked at data from real blooms in the Gulf, they found something fascinating. Check out these charts. You can see that the populations of certain bacteria grew right in lockstep with the algae. As the red tide algae, K. brevis, exploded in number, so did these bacteria. Now that is not the signature of a killer. That's the sign of a partner.
Which, of course, leads to the next big question. If they're not killing the algae, what are these friends doing for it? What's in it for the algae to have them around?
Well, the answer is pretty cool. They provide a symbiotic service. See, it turns out that Karenia brevis, for all its destructive power, has a weakness. It can't produce certain essential B vitamins on its own. It needs to get them from somewhere else. And that's where bacteria like Mameliella alba come in. They are basically personal vitamin factories for the algae, churning out vitamin B1, B7, and B12.
exactly what the algae needs to fuel its explosive growth.
So you see the picture that's emerging, right? You've got these two totally opposite forces at play. On one side, you have the bacterial assassins trying to take the algae down, and on the other, you have these bacterial allies feeding it the vitamins it needs to get huge. The entire life and death of a red tide bloom is basically the result of this tiny microscopic balancing act.
And here's the proof, side by side. These results show those two forces in direct competition. Look at the left. That shows how effective killers like P. spongiae are at wiping out the algae. The population just plummets. But then look at the right. That shows that when vitamins are low, the allies, like M. alba, can actually step in and help the algae grow anyway. It's a perfect illustration of this battle between friends and foes.
So it really all boils down to two opposing forces. You've got the allies that help the bloom get started and grow, and the assassins that eventually cause its collapse.
And the really wild takeaway here is that the fate of a massive red tide, a phenomenon so huge you can see it from space,
Is decided by this invisible war. It's all being controlled by this microscopic push and pull between competing bacteria. It's just an amazing reminder of how the absolute smallest things on our planet can shape our world in the absolute biggest ways. And all of this leaves us with a really exciting forward-looking question. Could we tip the scales? Now that we know who these killers are, could we maybe use them? Could we one day deploy these bacterial assassins to help mitigate these toxic blooms, to stop them before they get so destructive? It's a huge thought, but the science suggests it might just be possible.